In this video, you'll understand what is Spring and why Spring. I'll take you through a use case. We'll see if we are implementing the use case without Spring, what are the problems we are going to face, and we'll understand how Spring will solve those problems. So let me talk about the use case first. If you're talking about any application, you'll be having layers in your application. The downmost layer will be generally the data access layer, which will have the code to access the database. Above it will be the service layer, and above it will be the presentation layer. Hope you know what is the main intention of layering your application. The main intention is whenever the data access layer changes, the above layers should not be affected, or whenever service layer changes, the presentation layer should not be affected. That is the main intention of layering your application. Now, coming to the use case, assume that I am developing an application for bank, and in my database there is a table called as account table, which contains all the account related information. Corresponding to this table, I have a entity class account.java, which has all the properties related corresponding to account table. Now, I want to achieve a functionality of funds transfer. I want to transfer funds from one account to another account. So generally we'll start from the data access layer. What I did is I have written a interface called as account repository with these methods: find account by ID. If I pass account ID, it will give me the account object, and update method will take an account object and update the database. So this is my interface in data access layer. And today we want to implement this repository using JDBC. So I have implemented a JDBC account repository like this. Assume that there is JDBC code in these methods. Right now, for making the presentation short, I have not shown you the JDBC code. Assume that there is JDBC code here. So this is my JDBC implementation of account repository. Then coming to the service layer, I want to transfer funds from one account to other. There is a transfer method which is taking from account number to account number and the amount to be transferred. I have written an implementation of transfer service like this. So now transfer method is taking from account number to account number and amount. See the logic? It's calling account repository dot find account by ID. By passing the account number, it got the from account object. Similarly, by calling method on account repository, it is getting to account object, and from the from account debiting the amount, and in the to account creating the amount. Then the database has to be updated, so we are calling account repository dot update method and passing the account objects. So we assume that transfer will be done. Now, do you see any design issues in this code? Not the code issues. I want to check this code for design issues. Pause the video for a moment and try to analyze, are there any design issues? Okay, let me tell you. What if tomorrow I want to change my data access layer to use Hibernate or Java Persistence API? That means I want to change my data access layer. So you know, whenever I change my data access layer, it should not affect the presentation layer. So if you see, I am changing my data access layer. Today I have data access layer using JDBC. I want to change it to use Hibernate. So if I change the data access layer to use Hibernate, will it affect the service layer? Let us see. If you want to implement using Hibernate, let's assume that I have written another implementation of account repository using Hibernate. Now coming to service layer, yep, see, I am changing the variable type to Hibernate account repository, and I am calling methods on Hibernate account repository. That means changes in one layer is affecting the other layers. Now what should I do if I don't want this tight coupling. If you see this code, this transfer service IMPL is tightly coupled to an implementation of Hibernate. We don't want tight coupling, so what should we do? There are two things which you need to do. If you don't want your code to be tightly coupled, what you can do is, whenever you are declaring the dependency, don't declare the dependent variable as a class type. Declare it as a interface type. So here the dependent variable should be account repository, not the Hibernate account repository or JDBC account repository. And also, while initializing this variable, don't initialize the dependencies by using new operator. Let the initialization be delegated to a factory class. So whenever you are initializing a dependent variable, don't use new operator to create a dependent object. Let that be delegated to a factory class. Hope you know what is a factory class. Hope you know what is a design pattern, factory design pattern. Now, if I want to implement my own factory, let me see how I can implement. I have written beans.properties like this, where key is some key and value is a class name. Now, see my factory class, my own factory class. This is my own factory class, my bean factory. What is it doing? It is taking a bean name. Bean name, basically I'll assume that is a key to the .properties file. So if I pass account repository as an argument to get bean, see what it is doing. This logic is loading the .properties file and then getting the value for the particular key. That means here I'll get the class name, and this logic is using reflection API to create an object of the given class and returning it. So this is a simple bean factory implementation. Now, coming to the same code of transfer service, if you see, the dependent variable is of interface type now, and am I initializing the dependency using new operator? No, I am calling a method on my factory class and passing the account repository the key. So if this is my transfer service IMPL, do you see any design issues now? What if tomorrow I want to use Hibernate implementation of account repository? Do I need to change this transfer service IMPL code? No. Only thing is, I need to change my .properties file and initialize this this account repository with Hibernate account repository class. That's all. So I can say that my transfer service IMPL is loosely coupled with any implementation of account repository. So you understood that if you want loose coupling between the classes, two rules. What are there? First rule, dependent variable should be interface type. And second rule is, whenever you are initializing the dependency, initialize the dependency through a factory. Let the factory create your objects. Delegate the object creation to a factory. Then you can achieve loose coupling. But in this case, I have written my own factory class because I felt that this code is very simple. Some 5 lines of code are there here. So I thought of writing my own factory bin. But let me complicate the scenario. What if I want caching functionality? Caching functionality means whenever I call a method on account repository for the first time by passing an account ID, it should hit the database and get the data. Second time onwards, whenever I'm calling a method on account repository using same account number, it should not hit the database. So I want basically caching. So let me show you this code. So for the first time, whenever I call this method, it should hit the database and get the data. Second time onwards, it should not hit the database. It should retrieve the data from the cache. So let me think about an idea about how to implement the caching. One way is to implement caching using a proxy. Let me show you using a clear diagram. So whenever I ask a factory to give me an account repository object, this is the account repository object. If somehow the factory can create a proxy of account repository and return it to me, in my code I'll be calling methods on the proxy. Then this proxy can execute some logic which will check if the data is there in the cache. If the data is there in the cache, the proxy can return you the value directly from the cache. If the data is not there in the cache, what this proxy can do is it can delegate and call your original object method that will return you the data from the database. Then keep the return value in the cache. The proxy will keep the return value in the cache and return it. Second time, if you are calling a same method with same value on the proxy, then the proxy will check in the cache. Is there data? Yes. Then without hitting the original object, it will return you the value from the cache. So caching can be possible if I can get a proxy. But who has to create this proxy? The factory. Earlier, if you see my factory class method, this is my factory class method. Here the logic is containing only 5 lines. But now, if I want my factory to create a proxy automatically, then the number of lines in this factory class will increase. But you may ask me a question, hey, how does the factory understand when to create a proxy and when not to create a proxy? Okay, I'll just use something like annotations like this. If I use annotation like at cacheable on top of it, on top of this method, if I use at cacheable, then I want a cacheable proxy. Otherwise, I don't want a cacheable proxy. Now, this factory logic has to check if at least one of the method in my repository class is having cacheable annotation. This logic has to create a proxy and give it. So the factory class logic is growing in complexity. Now let me tell you one more scenario. If you see this transfer method, is this logic running in transaction? No, right? What will happen if the from account is updated in database, but before the to account is updated, if there is some network disconnection, what will happen? The amount will be debited from the from account but not credited to account. It's a problem. So what I want is if everything should be committed or rolled back. So I want my transfer method to run in a transaction. So what I want is a transaction to be started before calling the transfer method. I can again achieve this functionality using a proxy. Whenever I ask the factory to give me a transfer service object, this is your original transfer service object, and if the factory can give me a proxy of transfer service, whenever I want to call transfer method, I'll call transfer method on the proxy. Then the proxy will execute some logic which will start a transaction and then call the method. The method executes. If the method does not throw any exception, then the control will come back here. This logic will commit the transaction and then return it back. But if your method is throwing an exception, the exception will propagate to here, and here what rollback can be issued to database, and then the control will go back to your proxy. So you don't need to write transaction logic if somehow you can get a proxy. But who has to create a proxy and when? If at least one method of your class is annotated with some annotation like transactional, I want a proxy to be automatically created by the factory. I'll be happy if somebody can write this factory. If I have to write this factory which can create a transactional proxy or if I want to write a factory which can create a caching proxy, of course I can write, but the logic inside this method will be growing in complexity. Instead of me writing my own business logic, I'll be writing some other logic which does not give me money. So I'll be happy if somebody can give me a ready-made factory. Yes, Spring is a framework which can provide you with a ready-made factory which knows how to create objects by reading some configuration file, and this factory given by Spring knows when to create transactional proxies and when to create cacheable proxies based on your configuration. So what is Spring? Spring is a framework basically, or we can call Spring is a library which gives you with a ready-made factory class. Initially when Spring framework started, they started by implementing a factory. So Spring is a factory class. Spring is providing a factory class which we can readily use, right? So that is the reason why Spring, that is the first reason. Spring is a framework which is providing me a ready-made factory class so that I need not write the factory class. So that's the first reason. So now in Spring there is a interface. In Spring framework or in Spring library there is an interface called as Bean Factory. Now what we can do is we can use any of the implementation of Bean Factory. So Bean Factory is a interface, and there is a implementation of Bean Factory called as XML Bean Factory. As the name says, this XML Bean Factory will read the configurations from an XML file and it will create objects. But this XML Bean Factory is a world class in the world versions of Spring. In new versions of Spring, they have come up with a sub interface of Bean Factory called as application context. So application context is also an interface. There are again a lot of implementations of application context. One of the most popular one is class path application, class path XML application context. So we will see how to use class path XML application context given by Spring to create objects based on configurations present in XML in class path. Let us go and see how we can use it. But before I show you how to use Spring, let me show you with example what are the problems if I am not using Spring. So let us go through a simple use case. So basically, as I told you, I want to develop an application for a bank. So let me show you the database structure, and then I'll take you through the use case. So in my database, I have a table called as account, which contains all the account related details like account number, account balance, name, etc. And whenever a customer does any transaction like debit or credit, we want to store all the transaction related data inside another table called as transactions. Transaction history, actually the table name. And also one account can have many beneficiaries. So all the beneficiary related details are stored inside another table called as beneficiaries table. And in our application, we want to reward our customers with some reward amount whenever the customer does some transactions, some bulk transactions, like say $10,000 in a day. If they are transferring more than $10,000 in a day, we want to reward the customers with some amount. So all the reward related details we want to store in a separate table called as reward. So these are the tables in my database. Now corresponding to these tables, we want to create entity classes. So what we have done is, see, this project is containing the code without Spring, I'm explaining you this one. I have a table called as account, and this is a corresponding entity class account.java. It's containing name, account number, address, balance, and one account has multiple beneficiaries. So this is a beneficiary class. One account has set of beneficiaries, right? And transaction detail corresponding to transaction table. This is a transaction detail class which is having transaction ID, account number, the date on which the transaction is done, the transaction amount, transaction type. Transaction type is a enum where there are two transaction types, debit or credit. And corresponding to reward table, this is the reward class. So these are the domain classes or model classes in my application. Now coming to data access layer, repository layer. If I want to do any operation on account table, I can do it through this account repository. If you see, there are multiple methods: find account by account number, find all accounts, save an account, update and delete an account. These are all the methods in account repository. And this JDBC account repository is an implementation of this account repository using JDBC. Now, to write logic for any method, we need to get a connection. From where do we get a connection? From data source. So here I created a variable called as data source, and I am initializing this data source through constructor. So can I say that this account repository is dependent on data source? Yes. This JDBC account repository is dependent on data source. I'll be initializing this dependency through constructor. Don't worry about all this logic. Assume that there is some JDBC logic which takes account number and gives account object by firing a query on database. So like that, I have written implementation for all the methods using JDBC. Then to do any operations on reward table, there is an interface called as reward repository. Here I have methods to add a reward, get total reward amount for an account number, etc. And implementation of this reward repository is also written in JDBC. And here also, don't worry about the logic inside it. The JDBC reward repository is also dependent on data source, and I am initializing this data source through constructor. Now, one more. Corresponding to transaction table in my database, I have transaction repository interface. If I want to add or remove or do anything on transaction table, I'll do it through this interface. And for this interface also, there's a implementation in JDBC. This implementation is also dependent on data source, and I'm initializing the data source through the constructor. And again, don't worry about the logic inside these methods. I have written some JDBC code which will be using this data source. So these are the three repositories which I have in my data access layer, and these are the three implementations. Now coming to the service layer. In service layer, I have an interface called as email service. Basically what I want to do is, whenever my customer does either debit or credit, I want to send a mail to his mail ID. So I have a method called as send mail, which will have logic to send a mail. This is an interface, and I have an implementation of email service. Here I didn't write any implementation, just I'm printing mail sent. That's all. Now coming to bank service, I want my application to support transfer of funds from one account to another. So I have a method called as transfer. If I call this transfer method and pass from account to account and amount, the amount will be transferred. Similarly for debit, credit, create a new account, deactivate an account, activate an account, or get all accounts, I have methods in my bank service. Here is the important thing, bank service IMPL. Bank service IMPL is implementing this bank service, and see, it is having these four variables. I can say that my bank service is dependent on account repository, transaction repository, reward repository, and email service. And if you see the transfer method, see the logic inside transfer method. Transfer method is simply calling debit and also credit. What is the logic inside debit method? It is taking account number and the amount to be debited. So it is calling account repository dot find account by number. It is getting the account object, calling debit. So amount is debited, and it is calling update method. Amount is updated, account is updated on database. Then what? We have to insert a row inside transaction table as well. So here creating an object of transaction detail and adding a row into transaction table, right? So whenever amount is debited, what we are doing right now, we are updating the balance in the account, and also we are adding an entry into transaction table, right? That is what the code is doing, updating the account and adding an entry into transaction table. Then if email service is not null, this logic is sending the email. That is a debit logic. Similarly, here you have the logic for credit. Again, this is taking the account number, finding the account object, crediting the amount, updating the database. Then a row is added to transaction table, and email service is sending this email as well. So this is the logic inside my bank service. Now I have the transfer method, and you can see that transfer method is calling debit and credit. Debit and credit method are using all these things. So I can say that bank service is dependent on these four. So basically in this use case, what I mean to say is classes will be dependent on other classes to execute the logic. So my bank service is having all these four dependencies. Now what I want to do is, I don't want to create objects in my application. Suppose if I'm not using Spring, who is responsible for creating objects? The developer, me. I am responsible for creating objects, and the developer also is responsible for creating and initializing the dependent objects. Let me see the use case. Basically, I want to write a test case for testing this transfer method. See how I am implementing this test case without Spring. So basically, I want tables to be created. So I have this script table, scripts, which is containing the scripts for creating, dropping the tables if existing, and creating the tables, account table, beneficiary table, all those tables. And this scripts.sql is containing some insert statements to insert two accounts. One with the name Shiva, 10,000 is inserted, and one with name Prasad, 20,000 is inserted. And now what I want is, I want to transfer 5,000 from Shiva's account to Prasad's account. That is a use case, and I want to test. So see my test case. I have written a test case bank service test. Now you can see I create a variable of bank service, and basically what I want to test, I want to test transfer method. So I want to call transfer method on bank service. I want to do funds transfer from account number 1 to account number 2. How much? 5,000. So to test this, I need bank service object. But bank service object is dependent on 4. So whenever I am creating bank service IMPL, I need to set account repository, transaction repository, reward repository, and email service. So that means before creating bank service IMPL, I need to create these 4. But if you see, JDBC account repository is dependent on data source. So before even I create account repositories and transaction repository and all, I created data source. So I created data source inside the init method, which is annotated with before, setting all the credentials and all. When this data source is initialized, is passed to account repository, transaction repository, reward repository, email service also is created. Then those are passed to bank service. So basically, before I start testing, the bank service is initialized. To initialize bank service, I have to initialize their dependencies. So basically, if I am not using any framework like Spring, the developer, that means me, I am responsible for initializing, for creating all the dependent objects and initializing the dependencies. And also I am responsible for setting up the database. See, if you see, I'm calling setDB method, which is reading the script file and executing the script. Don't worry about the logic here. Here there is a logic to execute the script, which will initialize the tables. Then I am doing the funds transfer. Now let me check. The database name is what? SpringDB. So let me just open my database and check whether there is SpringDB. Yes, there is SpringDB. So what I'll do is I'll drop this database and I'll create a new database, SpringDB. Okay, the database is empty, so if I run this test case, the database will be created, right? So here the setup DB is executing the script and the script is having the statements to create. So let me run this test case and check whether it will work or not. So running as JUnit test. So test case is running. See, the scripts are executed, tables are created, and we are able to see the test case passed. Let me check in database. I'll refresh the database. See, in account, 5,000 is debited from Shiva's account and credited into Prasad's account. And see the transaction table. Transaction ID is 1, account number 1 is debited 5,000 and account number 2 is credited 5,000. So everything went fine. So my test case was successful. But now the problem is the developer is responsible for creating the object required and initializing all its dependencies. If you are using Spring framework, you need not do everything. Spring will take care of creating the objects and initializing the dependencies. Now let us see how to achieve the same functionality using Spring. So I have a project which is using Spring. So let me show you. This is a start project. So I'm working on start projects. So I'll show you how to create an XML file which is used by Spring. Now I'm right clicking on SRC main resources, new Spring Bean configuration file. Since I am using Spring toolsuit, which is also based on Eclipse, if you are comfortable with Eclipse, you should be comfortable with Spring toolsuit as well. Spring toolsuit is nothing but Eclipse with some Spring plugins. Since this is having some Spring plugins, I'll be able to create a Spring Bean configuration file through this wizard. So I'm selecting new Spring Bean configuration file and I'll give the file name. So I'll say beans.xml. And if you see here, there is something called as add Spring project nature if required. So if I'm creating any Spring related XML file, the project will become a Spring project. So I have selected it, let it be, next, and I'll say finish by taking all the defaults. If you see, the project is having yes on top of it. Yes means it is a Spring project. Now a XML file, empty XML file has been created where the root tag is beans. Beans tag belongs to this XSD schema. So whatever tags to come inside this XML are defined inside the spring-beans.xsd. Now what I'll do is I will create a bean definition. So basically whatever I did earlier programmatically in my test case, I'll do it here. So let me open my earlier test case. What I did, I created a data source and I have set all this, right? So I want to create a bean definition for basic data source. So I'll write a bean tag and give class is equals to basic data source. I'll press control space. Since this is a Spring toolsuit, if I press control space, it will show me all the classes. So I'm selecting basic data source and I'll give an ID, identifier for my bean, basic data source. Then in my code I was calling setter methods, right? So if you want setter method to be automatically called, then you have to write a property tag, property name, set what? Set URL. So since there is setter method for set URL in basic data source, URL is a property name. So I need to initialize it with a value. Value is equals to, I'll copy paste the same URL. So I'm initializing it. Then I'll initialize property username. Username for my database is root. And also passwords. Password also is the root. Then driver class name also I need to pass. This is a driver. So I configured basic data source as a bean. Then what I did here, I created JDBC account repository IMPL and passed a data source to constructor. So similarly, I'll try to create a bean definition for JDBC account repository. I'll give the ID. Okay, but now if you are seeing error, because if I don't pass anything, it will try to call the default constructor. Is there a default constructor for this? No, right? There is a constructor which is taking data source. So I want to tell to the factory, the application context, which is nothing but a factory of Spring, to call this constructor by passing data source reference. So if you want a constructor to be called by passing something, you have to pass constructor arg. Ref is equals to, you have to pass a reference of data source to it, right? So ref is equals to basic data source. So in this case, if I'm passing constructor arg tag, that means I'm telling to invoke a constructor which will take a reference of basic data source. So that's how I created a bean definition for JDBC account repository. Similarly, I'll configure bean definitions for others as well. So there is something called as JDBC transaction repository IMPL. I'll give the ID. And this also has to be passed with constructor arg, and ref is equals to data source. Similarly, I have one more bean, reward repository, JDBC reward repository IMPL, and again I'll pass ID is equals to. Then this also has to pass this with a constructor argument, constructor arg, and ref is equals to basic data source. Then there is one more bean for email service. See what I'm doing. I am creating here in my test case, I'm creating email service as well by invoking default constructor. So I'll configure a bean where class is equals to email service IMPL. I'll give an ID for this as well. So I have defined all these beans. Whatever I was doing in test case, I have configured the same thing. Then lastly, I have to create bank service IMPL bean. So I'll create a bean definition and class equals to bank service IMPL, bank service. And see, in my test case, I was calling setter methods, right? If I want a setter methods to be called, I should not use constructor arg, I should use property tags. And if I press control space, if there is a setter method inside the class, it will automatically show the name account repository, and I have to pass it with a reference of account repository, right? Ref is equals to account repository. Similarly, I have few more. Email service has to pass with reference of the bean with ID email service. then reward repository, again reference of reward repository bean, then transaction repository ref is equals to transaction repository. So these are the beans configured, these are the beans created. Okay, now I have configured the XML. Now what I want is, I want a factory to read this XML and create objects. So see what I am writing in this test case. So I'll open the test case. This was the earlier test case without using Spring. Now if I am using Spring, Spring will create, the factory given by Spring will create all these things. Now you don't need to do all these things. I'll delete all. So what I need to do is, I need to create an object called as class path there's a class with name class path. I pressed control space, class path XML application context. I'll say context is equals to new class path XML application context. See, there's a constructor which will take the file name. The file name is what? I give beans.xml, right? Beans.xml. So once this line is executed, the class path XML application context will read this beans.xml. Is it present in class path? Where is it present? It's present in src main resources. Src main resources means inside class path, since it is a Maven project. So this application context is created. Then what I'll do is simple context dot get bean. What is the name of the bean for bank service? What is the ID? I use bank service. So if I ask for a bean with ID, it will give me an object. Now I'll take it in a reference of bank service. But context.getBean, the return type of getBean is object. I need to cast it since I know it. So I got a reference of bank service. So what I'll do is, in the test case, I'll create a variable of bank service, and I will initialize it inside the init method. So whatever I was doing earlier through code, it is replaced with 2 lines. Now if I'm using Spring, so bank service is initialized, and this method setupdb is also not required as of now. I'll remove it. See, now my test case became very simple. Once this line is executed, what will happen is the application context, class path XML application context, will read all this XML. By reading this XML, it will load all the bean definitions. It will create basic data source using which constructor? Is there constructor arg? No, that means it will use default constructor and create an object. After object is created, it will call set URL and pass this value, set username, set password, set driver class name. So basically object is created and all dependent values are populated by calling setter methods. Similarly, here JDBC account repository IMPL is created, and it will use a constructor which is taking basic data source. So like that, all these beans are created and they are ready for use. When all these objects are created, once this line is executed, all the bean objects are created and they are ready for use. Then I'm asking get a bean, give me a bean reference. It gave me a bean reference and I'm using it. Let me test it now, whether this will work or not. Run as JUnit. See, you can see a lot of log statements. I'll explain you all these logs, but the test case has passed. So basically, if you are using Spring, the application context provided by Spring is responsible for creating all objects and initializing the objects with their dependencies. So I use a word called as initializing. So the application context is creating bank service and initializing it with all its dependencies. Instead of using the word initializing, I'll use the word injecting. So that is the word which is normally used. So I can say that the application context is responsible for bean creation and injecting its dependencies. Now, how is it injecting the dependencies? By calling the setter methods. So if I write property tag, it is initializing the dependency by calling setter method, or I can use a word called as setter injection. I can say that application context is doing setter injection here. And here what type of injection is done? Data source is injected via constructor. So I can say that the application context is doing constructor injection. So basically, application context is responsible for creating your objects and injecting their dependencies either via constructor injection or via setter injection, right? So as we understood earlier, in Spring it provides us with a factory implementation. As I told you earlier, Bean factory is a interface, and it is having an implementation called as XML Bean factory, but this we don't use. It was an old class. In new versions there is a subtype of Bean factory called as application context. This is again an interface, and there is implementation. There are a lot of implementations. Class path XML application context is an application context, right? So that's what we used. So we can say that class path XML application context is a factory provided by Spring, right? So we understood how to use class path XML application context. Okay, so now let me introduce you to some terminology. Here, who is actually creating all the objects and initializing the dependencies? Application context. Basically, hope you might be knowing what is a container. You might have heard about servlet container, applet container, EJB container, etc. So my question is now, what is a container? Basically, container is something which will create objects and maintain the life cycle of objects. Servlet container creates servlets and maintains the life cycle of servlets. EJB container creates EJBs and maintains life cycle of EJBs. So anything which creates objects and maintains the life cycle is a container. Here, can I say that application context is creating all these objects and initializing the dependencies? Yes. And also we'll see later that application context is also responsible for managing the life cycle of these beans. So can I call application context as a container? Yes. Application context is a container provided by Spring. So now to summarize, what is Spring Framework? Spring Framework is nothing but a library which provides as a ready-made factory, or I can use another word. Spring is a framework which provides me a container. Application context is nothing but our container, and this container is a lightweight container compared to some heavyweight containers like EJBs. So Spring is a framework which provides me a lightweight container, and what this container does, container will create objects and inject the dependencies. So I can say that Spring is a framework which provides as a lightweight dependency injection container. Dependency injection container. So Spring is a framework which provides as a lightweight dependency injection container. Hope now you understood what is Spring Framework. And the Spring Framework is doing dependencies by calling either setter methods or constructors, right? So there are two types of injections basically right now: constructor injection, setter injection. So if you are using constructor arg tag, we say that application context is doing constructor injection. If I use property tag, it will do setter injection. So in this video, you understood about a basic program without Spring, and you understood that without Spring, the developer is responsible for creating all these objects and initializing dependencies, and if you are using Spring, the Spring's application context will do all that for us. Till now, we have used a class path XML application context because my XML was in class path. What if my XML is not in class path? There is one more application context. Actually, as you know, application context is an interface. So let me just initialize, create a variable of type interface, and I can initialize it with any of the implementation. There is an implementation called as file system XML application context, so I can use it. But now I have to give the path of the XML in file system, like in C drive, D drive, etc. So there are a lot of other application context implementations as well. We'll see going on further. Till now, you have understood some basics of Spring framework, that Spring is a lightweight dependency. Spring is a framework which provides lightweight dependency injection container, and we have seen how to use this application context. Now what you can do is you can just go through the lab documentation. So hope you might have downloaded the Spring Basics Labs docs. So there are two documentations. The first documentation talks about the application without Spring. Sorry, not this one. This will talk about the application without Spring, and the second document, XMLDI, talks with the same application using Spring. Now you have to go through these documents and complete the exercises. Remember, you always have to work on start projects. Solution contains a full solution. Don't try to see the solution until you are unless you are stuck somewhere. Okay, see you in next video to discuss some more concepts.